I was in a 2-day evidentiary hearing and I accepted the judge's rulings.
BJ Penn appeared in Hawaii Circuit Court on March 2, 2026 for a hearing tied to multiple misdemeanor charges including family abuse and restraining order violations, and the case that had been building for months through missed evaluations and escalating incidents finally reached a moment where the court drew a hard line. The central issue was not guilt or innocence. It was a state-ordered mental health evaluation that Penn had been resisting, and the defense arrived at the hearing with a motion asking the court to accept a prior voluntary evaluation that had, in Penn's camp's framing, already cleared him of mental fitness concerns. The prosecution's counter was specific and difficult to dismiss. The prior evaluation lacked depth, relied too heavily on Penn's own self-reporting without independent verification, and the distinction between what someone says about themselves and what can be confirmed externally became the hinge point of the entire hearing. Judge Peter Kubota listened to both sides, weighed the arguments, denied the defense motion, and then issued the warning that changed the character of the proceeding. If Penn continued to refuse or delay the evaluation, the court would consider contempt proceedings that could result in immediate jail time. The consequences were no longer tied to what happened in 2025, the arrests, the charges, the protection order violations. They were tied to the present, to what happens in the next window of compliance, which is the specific kind of consequence that does not wait for a trial to establish itself. What Penn said in response reveals the disconnect that sits at the center of this entire legal saga. From his perspective, he was not refusing to cooperate with a mental health process. He was protecting his reputation, his income, his ability to earn money through appearances, his public identity that the evaluation could damage regardless of the outcome.
2 weeks before you made the decision for me to do a mental health exam, I was in a 2-day evidentiary hearing.
The court is focused on competency, whether he understands the proceedings, whether he can assist in his own defense, and Penn was focused on how the evaluation looks and what it means for who he is outside that courtroom. And those two priorities do not align and do not overlap. 2 weeks before you made the decision for me to do a mental health exam, I was in a 2-day evidentiary hearing. That statement from Penn captures not just frustration, but a fundamental disconnect about why the situation has escalated to this specific point at this specific moment. From his perspective, he had already participated in prior proceedings, had already demonstrated engagement with the system, had already followed previous rulings. So the shift toward formally questioning his mental fitness does not register as a natural legal progression. It registers as an escalation he does not fully accept. But from the court's perspective, that escalation is exactly what the accumulated pattern demanded. The arrests, the repeated violations, the consistency of a specific belief that his family members had been replaced by imposters attempting to take control of family assets. That last element is not background noise, it is central. Because if that is the framework Penn is operating from, then every legal order, every restriction, every accusation is being interpreted through the lens of a reality the court does not accept, which means compliance does not just feel difficult, it may feel functionally impossible. You cannot agree to the demands of a system built on a version of reality you do not accept, and that is the specific tension that defines this case. Not just what happened, but how it is understood from the inside of Penn's experience versus how it is understood from the outside by the legal structure trying to process it.
Former UFC superstar BJ Penn claims he was never told about his appointment for a court-ordered mental exam.
The missed evaluation in December 2025 is where the pattern crystallized into something the court could no longer treat as administrative delay. Penn had been scheduled for the first court-ordered mental exam, and he did not show up, contributing to delays that pushed the case further into 2026. When he returned to court in January 2026, he did not acknowledge the miss and move forward. He challenged it, claiming he had never been properly informed of the appointment date and that he learned of it only indirectly through court documents reviewed by a third party. That claim introduced a new layer of conflict because now it was not just about the evaluation itself, it was about communication, representation, and whether his attorney had been functioning as an adequate advocate, which led to Penn filing motions to replace his attorney, to remove the judge, and to challenge the structural framework of the case. When you stack all of that together, the missed evaluation, the blame placed on counsel, the attempt to remove both attorney and judge, you start to see a pattern that goes beyond legal strategy and begins to look like resistance to the entire process, which is the specific dynamic the mental health evaluation is designed to assess. The critical legal question that resistance raises is whether the defendant is refusing to cooperate or whether he is unable to cooperate. And that question is the actual gatekeeper of the case, because the answer determines whether the court responds with penalties or with psychiatric intervention. If the answer is refusal, the court moves forward with contempt proceedings and the penalties that come with them. If the answer is inability, if there is a genuine question about mental fitness to stand trial, the court has a constitutional obligation to pause and evaluate before any proceedings can continue. The prior voluntary mental health evaluation that the defense cited as sufficient and the prosecution rejected as inadequate is the specific document that made Judge Kubota's decision inevitable, because the evaluation was conducted largely through self-reporting without the independent verification that fitness for trial determinations require. Self-reporting in a mental health context is the least reliable form of assessment precisely because the question being asked, whether the person understands the reality of their legal situation, is the same question that the person's self-report is attempting to answer. You cannot determine whether someone's perception of reality is accurate by asking them whether their perception of reality is accurate and accepting their answer as the primary evidence, which is the logical problem at the center of why the prosecution rejected the prior evaluation and why the judge agreed with them. Penn's argument that the evaluation would damage his public image and hurt his ability to earn money through appearances is the most revealing moment in the March 2nd hearing, because it demonstrates the exact concern the court has about his ability to understand what is actually at stake. A man facing potential jail time for contempt proceedings, standing in a courtroom where the charges against him include family abuse and protection order violations, and his primary articulated concern about the mental health evaluation is what it does to his brand and his appearance fees. That gap between the legal reality and the perceived priority is the court's concern made visible in real time. The warning Judge Kubota issued is not a threat. It is the court's most direct available communication that the process has reached the point where Penn's framing of the situation and the legal system's framing of the situation need to be reconciled before anything else can proceed.
The claims about imposters, the persistent belief that family members, including his mother, had been replaced by people attempting to take control of family assets, are documented in court filings and public statements, and represent the belief system the evaluation is specifically designed to assess. The court is not asking whether those beliefs are true. That is not a legal question the court is positioned to answer. The court is asking whether those beliefs affect Penn's ability to understand legal reality in a way that would prevent him from receiving a fair trial. That distinction is the entire substance of the fitness for trial evaluation, not a judgment about whether someone's beliefs are rational or irrational in an abstract sense, but a specific legal determination about whether those beliefs compromise the functional capacities required to stand trial. The competency standard requires that a defendant understand the nature of the proceedings against them and be able to assist in their own defense. And if the framework Penn is operating from systematically reinterprets every legal development through the lens of an imposter conspiracy, those functional capacities may be compromised in ways that make proceeding to trial unconstitutional. The potential outcome of the evaluation is the specific detail that gives the entire situation its weight. If Penn is found unfit to stand trial, he could be committed to a state facility such as Hawaii State Hospital until competency is restored, which is not a sentence, not a punishment, but a different kind of removal from autonomy that the legal system enforces without negotiation. For someone whose identity was built on being B.J. Penn, the prodigy, the UFC champion, the fighter who walked into the cage and imposed his will on everyone placed in front of him, the prospect of being committed to a psychiatric facility and held there until a panel of doctors determines he is restored to competency represents something more definitive than any court sentence. The full arc of B.J. Penn's legal situation from 2024 through the March 2026 hearing is the story of a string of incidents that individually might have been managed through the legal system's standard processes, but collectively created a pattern that the standard processes could no longer contain. The repeated arrests, the protection orders, the family-related incidents, the assault charges, each one added to a record that judges and prosecutors could no longer treat as isolated events because the consistency of the pattern across time and across different types of incidents signals something systemic rather than situational. The mental health evaluation is not the prosecution's primary weapon against Penn. It is the legal system's attempt to determine whether the person it is about to prosecute can genuinely understand what is being done to him, which is a protection for the defendant as much as it is a tool for the court. The legal system cannot proceed to trial against someone who does not understand the nature of the proceedings. Doing so would violate fundamental due process protections that exist specifically to prevent the state from using its power against someone who lacks the capacity to defend against it. That protection cuts both ways. It prevents the state from railroading someone who cannot defend themselves, but it also means that if Penn is found unfit, the case does not simply go away. It pauses in a form that removes him from public life until the evaluation reaches a different conclusion. The goodbye in the framing of this story may not be about a prison sentence at all. It may be about the end of the public identity, the end of the control, the end of the version of B.J. Penn that people once recognized as the prodigy who became a UFC champion, because sometimes the most definitive endings do not come from a judge's ruling.
The career that B.J. Penn built is one of the most genuinely remarkable competitive stories in the history of the sport. He became the first person to win titles in 2 different weight classes in the UFC. He won the lightweight and welterweight championships, and at his peak, he was considered by many to be the most naturally gifted fighter the sport had ever produced. His jiu-jitsu was otherworldly. He received his black belt in less than 3 years from Renzo Gracie, a timeline that the entire grappling community considered essentially impossible before Penn accomplished it. And his hands were devastating. His cardio was legendary when he was motivated, and his ceiling as a competitor generated genuine debates about whether he was the greatest pound-for-pound fighter on the planet. The gap between the prodigy at his best, the fighter who tapped Matt Hughes with a rear naked choke, who submitted Renzo Gracie himself as a brown belt, who dominated the lightweight division with a combination of natural talent and technical sophistication that the division had never seen, and the man standing in that Hawaii courtroom, is not just a cautionary tale about what happens after a fighting career ends. It is something more specific and more uncomfortable. The story of what happens when the systems that sustain a person during their competitive years, the structure of training camps, the discipline of weight cuts, the external accountability of coaches and opponents, disappear and leave behind the unstructured space that post-career life creates. The MMA community has watched that transition produce tragedy multiple times across different generations of fighters. The specific combination of head trauma accumulated over a career, the loss of identity that comes when the thing that defined you stops being available, and the financial and personal instability that often follows retirement in a sport that does not produce the pension structures and union protections that other professional athletes receive. Whatever the mental health evaluation ultimately reveals about BJ Penn's current state, the broader conversation his situation demands is about what the sport owes its most celebrated competitors after the cameras stop rolling and the championships stop being won, and the only remaining question is whether the person who used to be the prodigy understands what is happening to him. The May 13, 2026 court date is the next hard point on the timeline. Penn ordered to complete the mental health evaluation and return with results, the case held in place by a single unanswered question not about what he did, but about whether he fully understands what is happening to him. Two paths from that date. If the evaluation finds him fit to stand trial, the case moves forward in a familiar direction with evidence presented, charges argued, and outcomes determined within the standard legal structure. And if the evaluation finds him unfit, the case stops again for a completely different reason. Committed to a state facility until competency is restored. That is the specific language that represents the outcome no one in the MMA community wants to be the final chapter of BJ Penn's story. Not because it is unjust within the legal framework, but because of what it means about the distance between who he was and who he has become. The legal system cannot tell us whether that distance is the product of the head trauma accumulated across a career or the loss of structure that athletic competition provided, or something that was always present beneath the surface but contained by the demands of elite competition. It can only determine whether he is fit to stand trial. The people who were trained by him, who trained alongside him, who competed against him, who watched him become the prodigy and then watched the prodigy become a legend, they are watching a process that the legal system is designed to execute without emotion, and they are feeling things that the legal system does not have a mechanism for processing. Whether the ending comes through trial, through treatment, or through something in between, the version of BJ Penn that the sport knew, the natural genius who made figure skating look like figure skating before going on offense, who made jiu-jitsu look like jiu-jitsu before it was popular, who won titles in 2 divisions before anyone else in the history of the organization, that version is already in the past. And May 13, 2026 is the date when the legal system decides what happens to whatever remains of the future.